my understanding of like the aerospace sector, the manufacturing sector, the biotech sector has so vastly improved over the course of the experience of Varda. And I think that really has, sort of reflected in the quality of the investing that I've done over, sort of the past several years, and has just made me much more comfortable in diving into sort of some of these areas. I think my ability to diligence things in biotech, in industrials, in robotics, in aerospace is so improved for having such, sort of close to the metal, sort of experience with this. I was talking about this actually with a, sort of friend over lunch. I think if you look at, people that land on like the top 10 of the Midas list, every year, you'll find that about a decade later, like half of that top 10, nobody thinks about it anymore. Like there are people that have just like totally sort of fallen off the face of the planet. But then you look at somebody like, sort of our, sort of CEO and, original co-founder of Founders Fund, Peter Thiel. I would argue, while, he doesn't necessarily always submit to the Midas list, I would very easily argue he's been one of the top, sort of 10 VCs in the Valley for the past several decades, combined, right?
Welcome to Sorcery's podcast. I'm Molly O'Shea, the founder of Sorcery, a weekly top VC deals newsletter highlighting the top GPs, founders, and deal announcements leading the next innovation cycle. Today, I'm very excited. We have someone who might not even need an introduction. We have Delian from Founders Fund. He was recently promoted to partner, and he has been investing there for the past 5 years. He's also co-founder and president of Varda Space Industries, which is building the world's first space factories. Before Founders Fund, he was a principal at Khosla Ventures. I hope you enjoy.
Hi, Delian. It's great to have you on.
Thanks, Molly. Look forward to hanging in LA soon.
So we have a couple of big congratulations for you that we'll get into today. First, Varda's landing. This is a big deal. Your promotion to partner at Founders Fund, and most importantly, your new title as a father.
Which, by the way, effectively those three were my goals that I set for myself when I was like 24 years old. I basically said, by the time I'm 30, I want to be a father, I want to be a partner in $1 billion plus fund, and I want to start basically a successful space company. And so, yeah, basically, effectively all three of those landed in like the last, sort of 7-8 months, right on time. So now I got to start thinking, do I set up, goals for 35, or do I just say, this is it? Kurt Cobain, it never gets any better than this. Gotta go out with style.
Well, if anything, you are just validating that manifestation works, and maybe you belong in LA.
Exactly.
So to kind of just dive right in, your launch, Varda's launch was my #1 newsletter of 2023. Now the landing will make it full circle. This was a huge accomplishment for the space sector, and it seems like every week there's a new announcement for Varda and your team. Could you share more about Varda, its founding, and the launch into space?
Yeah. So the idea behind Varda, was predicated on an idea that, I can't necessarily say, I came up with. There are actually, sort of papers from the 1960s that, sort of theorize about the value of doing sort of solid state crystalline, work across a variety of materials in the environment of microgravity that you get in space. And that work has been expanded on, obviously, over the past, sort of, 60 years. In particular, really took off in the space, sort of, Skylab, Space Shuttle, and then ultimately, sort of ISS era. I really, sort of got fascinated with this, sort of, let's say, scientific field and world in the, sort of 2011 timeframe, and really thought that it, sort of painted a potential path to humanity having an industrial future in space rather than just an exploratory future in space. And I felt like that was the way that you really made something truly sustainable, right? I think a part of why, the Apollo era, while it had a lot of success, ultimately didn't turn into a, sort of permanent capability that humanity had, was because it was ultimately entirely based off of state budgets and entirely exploratory. But ultimately, if you look at everything from, the Chinese and Portuguese Empire in the 15th century, to, Lewis and Clark, to the original American colonies, the only reason that there ever is a sort of more permanent human establishment anytime in human history is ultimately, through economic means and through the means of production. And so tracked this idea in space for quite some time. I considered working on it, sort of seriously in 2011, 12, ultimately kind of put the idea on the shelf. And then in 2019, for the first time in Q4, a rocket launched and landed for the first time 4 times in a row, which to me was the first time where it was like, this is no longer a, sort of fluke. This is a pattern. And it means that, rocket landing is going to be very regular. And so that means access to space should be much cheaper. And so as I started to think about this field, sort of my immediate, let's say, assumption was, while all this work to date has happened, as a part of the space shuttle or as a part of, the International Space Station, that's a great place to do sort of basic research and, sort of push the scientific frontier. But, ultimately, if you think about the, sort of economics of sustaining a human in orbit, it's just incredibly expensive, incredibly complex. And so if you want to, sort of commercialize this type of work in the near term, you need to do it in a, sort of fully automated and much more cost-effective, sort of manner. And so in Q4 2019, Q1 20, I actually went out to various groups that had been working on this problem of, sort of space manufacturing, utilizing the microgravity environment for materials, and basically pitched them on what is now the Varda architecture. And that, rather than basically, again, doing any of this work inside of the International Space Station, instead, how do you make something that looks closer to a Starlink satellite with a small little, sort of capsule, reentry pod that ideally costs more like $500K rather than something like the sort of Cargo or Crew Dragon that are over $100 million. And that's the way to really sort of prove out this business model. And funnily enough, I kind of got shut down by everyone. Sort of the reaction was, that's a very difficult problem. Nobody's ever done that before. And also, in some ways, most importantly, this does not fit within NASA's priorities. And so NASA is not going to fund this because they only want things where humans are on board, because ultimately they're responsible to Congress. And they believe that the best sort of marketing for low Earth orbit is having humans there. This is not on that path. And so kind of put the idea on the shelf. COVID hits. Peter at Founders Fund basically tells us, go on a 6-month vacation. We're not going to be deploying any capital. And so I had a lot more, sort of free time and free space. And I kind of had the idea. I was like, man, it's pretty frustrating that it finally feels like, this idea's time it's finally ripe and nobody's doing it correctly. And so I realized in that moment, I was like, I think I just have to do this, sort of myself. And so, went to a couple of, sort of SpaceX buddies, pulled together, sort of the founding team, and sort of came to them with this, like, sort of napkin, sort of spreadsheet and architecture where I was like, look, I'm not an aerospace engineer, but to me, it seems like you could build something like Starlink. You could build a much smaller reentry capsule. Shouldn't that all be doable? And shouldn't we be able to do this for a relatively, like, small amount of capital? It's not like $1 billion, type project. And the reaction at first was like, you're crazy. Like, reentry capsules cost $1 billion. That's not going to happen. And then in practice, as people started to dig in, they were like, actually, there is this like reentry capsule from the 1960s called the Corona capsule. And they did actually build it for pretty cheaply. And they did fly it like over, 100 and, I think like 34 times, sort of total. Maybe if they did it in like the, mid 50s and 60s, we can probably, sort of do it today, as well. And so, yeah, lo and behold, sort of, 3.5 years basically from, opening office doors, about 4 years almost since I was working on it. We were able to land our first reentry capsule in the middle of the Utah desert. And it is, while that capsule, is the, let's say, size of a, sort of trash can, a little bit larger, and maybe, sort of looks simplistic, I do think it is a really profound moment for the space industry where you now have this opportunity to not only launch very cheaply, obviously on a SpaceX rocket, but we've actually proven that you can land very cheaply in a way that, we think is much more sustainable for commercial activity where, we landed on U.S. soil, so you don't need, sort of tons of helicopters and ships in an inflatable, reentry capsule. You can do a very low cost reentry capsule that you can just pick up with a couple guys in an ATV rather than, some highly complex equipment out in the ocean. And we were able to get sort of regulators and military rating partners on board for it as well, which was pretty non-trivial. As as you probably saw, we were up in orbit for a lot longer than we were originally expecting. But now that we cut that sort of all across the line, it's pretty awesome to see. So yeah, I'm proud to say that we started the company that basically landed the first ever commercial reentry capsule on U.S. soil with also a new regulatory regime, Part 450 with the FAA. So yeah, it was a lot of historic firsts, and hopefully we look forward to this year doing it multiple times and making this seem sort of totally routine, just like rockets landing is totally routine.
I definitely think you will be doing that multiple times, given your ambition and your willingness to not accept no as an answer. In terms of the cost differentiation, is there a multiple difference of how much it costs you to put your capsule into space and back down versus, let's say, the government?
Like the rough sort of napkin math you can do is by our call it sort of fifth or sixth mission, we expect our per mission cost to be sort of $3.5-4 million. If you look at how much sort of SpaceX contracts sort of crew and cargo Dragon flights for, at a bare minimum that's sort of $40 million. Let alone the idea of to dock with the International Space Station, the hardware on board, the manufacturing, the reentry operations, et cetera. And so, I call it's like minimum of 10x, but more realistically, it is probably closer to like 100, if not 1,000x, when you take into account the cost of astronaut time, NASA infrastructure, et cetera. And I'm very glad like both of these paths should exist, right? I think it's really great to see a wide set of companies, SpaceX on down, working on this type of human-rated infrastructure. Because if Varda really sees its, gets to its ultimate success and continues to scale up our automated factories, at some point we will want, a human on board to do some level of, maintenance or operation of these larger space factories. And so, you want both, to proceed in parallel. But, it really feels like there's a lot of investments and activity both from NASA and private companies on the human-rated portion of, like, let's say the tech tree, and it feels like it's basically only Varda on the autonomous sort of tech tree. And so there should probably be a little bit more of an even balance if we're looking for or looking to see the fastest path to the establishment of a sort of real economy in low Earth orbit. But probably call it that differential being anywhere from minimum 10x to probably more realistic sort of 1000x. In some ways, that's actually like the real competition for Varda is not these human rated platforms. They're so far off in economics. The real competition is like, can you actually do this in a way that integrates into people's terrestrial sort of supply chains and terrestrial alternatives? So we never think about like the ISS being our competitor. We think about what are alternatives for people to solve this, solve the problems that we solve on Earth, in different ways. And is microgravity always the most effective or the only way to solve the problem that a customer is experiencing?
I was actually thinking about this earlier today when I was prepping for our call, but when you started Varda, did you even think about having competitors in the market? Like, obviously, this is just such a unique problem to solve, and it's very mission driven. But how do you even think about competitors?
Yeah, it's funny. I had an investor ask me the same question yesterday. Like, what do you think about like, somebody coming in as a second mover once you're proving this out? And it's just, my response is like, best of luck. Like, please do, I would love if other people tried to tackle this. The difficulty in getting, sort of aerospace engineers, hypersonic analysts, pharma chemists, people that understand the BD into this, like, pharma world, sort of, reg affairs team, sort of DC Hill affairs team, getting that all under one roof, integrated into a cohesive, like, sort of team and DNA and culture has been just like such an incredibly difficult problem for my co-founder and I, that the idea of like somebody else trying to do this, I'm like, please go right on ahead. You know what I mean? There have been, sort of quote unquote competitors that try to tackle very narrow components of what we do, right? There's people that just do the reentry capsule. There's people that just try to do the zero gravity, sort of pharma manufacturing, right? But these, sort of narrow, let's say competitors or narrow alternative attempts, I think are highly unlikely to succeed. In that, part of why we've had a lot of success with Varda is because we sort of fully control our entire supply chain. And so when we present to a customer, they don't need to think about, right, our pharmaceutical customers, they don't need to think about aerospace, they don't need to think about rockets, they don't need to think about microgravity. We just go to them with a, basically tool in their toolkit that can solve very unique challenges. But we handle everything from there. They hand us a drug molecule, we hand them back a like solved formulation. Not like they hand us a drug molecule and then we say, okay, but like, who do you want to launch on and who's going to bring this back, et cetera. Like top 20 biopharma don't know how to think about hardware or space, right? And we completely abstract, sort of all those details. And then maybe in theory, some of these narrow competitors could like partner together. And I'm like, man, I have a hard enough time figuring out how to do this thing when we control all of it, let alone the idea of now multiple companies trying to collaborate and somehow make this thing happen. It's like, dear Lord, please go, so give it your best shot. We would love for more folks to tackle this.
Well, that's a more supportive approach versus the people who in the beginning told you not to even go after it, that it will be multi-billion dollars. So at least you're encouraging of the ecosystem.
Yeah, no, it was fun. When we landed our capsule, most of the team was focused on sort of celebrating. They were going out and having a good time. I instead was focused on emailing our 15 earliest haters that said we would never land a reentry capsule on U.S. soil, and making sure to sort of email them photos of the capsule and being like, look at us now.
Seems like true Delian fashion. Just go get them.
I do love myself a sort of self-invented grudge. I love to hold them.
Yeah, well, Dave Portnoy does something similar, except he gets like a champagne bottle and etches all of his enemies' names into them, and when something bad happens to them, he pops the champagne and drinks it.
Oh, that's good. I should start doing that. I like that. Yeah, I gotta take a slice out of sort of his strategy.
It's surely a spiteful approach, but to go back to the idea maze of founding Varda, so you got into now pharma manufacturing. So would love to understand how you ended up landing a couple of pharma customers and the testing process from that?
Yeah, when we started the company, it was admittedly a little bit of a wider, sort of aperture in terms of, let's say business models, materials that we wanted to tackle. If you look at our very first, sort of seed round pitch deck, we do talk about, look, there's, gravity has a wide variety of effects. We're going to need to spend some time to actually go through and understand these, sort of, let's say, sort of fields, materials, results ourselves. And, it's just, not really, sort of possible, to do this without literally working on it full time, because ultimately, like, while there have been a lot of research papers and NASA sort of publications about this, you can't really figure this out until you really start to dig in, talk to the end customers, and start to try to replicate some of this work yourself. So yeah, like I mentioned, we started off with a really wide aperture, and within about a year and a quarter or so of starting the company, it was just incredibly clear that there was really only one path forward, which is around the basically formulation of small molecule pharmaceuticals. And so we, pretty rapidly discarded basically everything else on the commercial side of things. So, commercially, Varda fundamentally is a biotech company focused on the formulation of small molecules. Our business model looks very similar to other formulation technology companies, like Halozyme, Electrify being, sort of two of my, sort of favorite recent examples. And then we have a DoD business that is obviously focused on the architecture of our spacecraft, and totally unrelated to the commercial, business. Part of why we landed there, it was a couple of different things. First, if you look at it, the active ingredients in pharmaceuticals are fundamentally the highest value, sort of objects by unit mass on the planet, Earth. And the limitation of this business model is really sort of mass to orbit. And so if you look at it from the sort of mass equation, fundamentally, small molecules wins there. The second is, if you look at just like the sort of processing complexity, basically the step that needs to actually happen in microgravity in terms of processing. Small molecule, solid state crystallization is actually just like a much simpler process than some of the other materials that have been theorized. Fiber optics, semiconductors, human organs, all of those have very highly complex, sort of processes that felt like it was sort of too much to sort of bite off. And then in some ways, sort of third is if you look at a lot of the other sort of models, or a lot of the other materials, the only real business models that you could do in them was what I call like lemonade stand style economics, where you produce the material, you sell the material, it's for a fixed price. Versus in the world of pharmaceuticals, there are some more, let's say, aligned incentives that you can have with your end customer, where in all the Varda contracts we have to date, we not only do some amount of payment for the actual sort of flight discovery of the new sort of pharmaceutical product, but then we also get to participate in a risk sharing model where we also get to participate in the upside of the compound. Versus that's not the case in some of these sort of in semiconductor world, a little bit more so, but definitely not in sort of fiber optic world. And so yeah, across all three, let's say sort of dimensions that we analyze, price per unit mass, complexity of processing, and sort of value capture potential, it was just very obvious that sort of pharmaceuticals, and in particular small molecules, were by far the winning contender there. So in some ways, it's been interesting to see since Varda started, there have been a couple of sort of very early stage, none of these people have tons of funding or anything, but there have been a couple of companies come up starting to try to tackle non-pharmaceutical product areas in microgravity manufacturing. And to me, I just find it quite confusing, because they always phrase it as like, well, Varda's going to go to this, we're tackling these other things. I'm like, man, we looked at those other things. Like every single one of those other things, we talked to customers, almost had signed contracts with them. We went very, very deep, but it's like those areas were very difficult to make everything sort of pencil out. And so I'm kind of skeptical, honestly, at this point of anything in some ways other than the particular use case that we landed on. It's not like we were like, oh, this one's number one, but there's a close number two that we would have done if not for the number one. It was like, this is number one, and then it's like a very, very long gap to the number 2, 3, 4.
Is a function of that being the need for the science research in this field, and maybe B, they actually have the budget to go after it versus other industries? Does pharma have more research dollars to work towards these things because they're more critical?
A bit. I would say, pharma is more willing to make, sort of long-term bets, because that is fundamentally what pharma does. They make, sort of long-term, R&D bets. But, at the end of the day, it still has to translate to, commercializable, sort of value. So it's not like you get this indefinite, sort of R&D dollar. It eventually has to be, translated into, sort of commercial dollars. So I wouldn't say that pharma needs microgravity. It's not something that was sort of top of mind for people. But in the world of small molecules, where we play, which is sort of a category of compounds that is actually the majority of pharmaceutical products on the market today, in the vast majority, there hasn't been actually a real innovation in the world of the formulation and development of these types of compounds in almost 20 years, at this point. And so I think a part of the attraction is that, while there are a lot of new areas like mRNA, biologics, et cetera, and there are a lot of formulation, new technologies occurring in those areas, formulation of, solid state, small molecule work basically has been stagnant for 20 years. And so I think a part of the interest in Varda has been, this is the first new tool in the tool set for a process that affects 90% of the drugs on the market, and also this is a sort of industry that is very willing to obviously sort of bet on R&D that they think gives them a real competitive advantage. And so I think that's what's a lot of led to our ability to assign these first handful of sort of pharma customers that we look forward to announcing over the next quarter or so.
On Twitter today, I did read that Varda is a part of enabling a new field of research in gravity for science and manufacturing. So how do you determine what materials to work on and the effects in gravity?
Yeah, so what we found very surprising when we first started the company is if you looked at like the past sort of 40 years of research, I would argue that it is sort of closer to monkeys throwing darts at a dartboard versus like a true scientific process where people were basically taking however their pharmaceutical process worked down here on Earth and just running that exact same process in space and then just seeing if the result was different effectively. And that was effectively it. That was where the scientific field basically ended. Our sort of thesis, at this point, almost a year and a half, 2 years ago, was well, if the whole point of going up to microgravity is that you're studying how the material is sensitive to gravity, is that not something that you can do down here on Earth? Because yes, we all experience sort of 1G at the surface of the planet, and you can't decrease gravity here on the surface of the planet, but you can simulate an increase in gravity, right? You can basically spin up a large scale centrifuge and use that to experience effectively 2G, 3G, 4G. It's sort of the opposite of going to orbit, right? The reason you experience zero gravity in orbit is because the centrifugal force basically perfectly cancels out the gravitational force. Well, what if instead we actually just have this centrifugal force rather than canceling out, add on to the gravity force that we experience down here on Earth, and use that to actually study basically what is the effect of various material systems and how are they sensitive to increasing levels of gravity, so that we can use that to basically extrapolate downwards to what actually will happen in zero gravity. So that way you can do a lot of this type of, let's say, pre-screening and sort of faster learning here on the ground. Like the very 5-year-old version, let's say, of the paper that we published today is if at 1G your drug is medium, and at 2G and 3G and 4G, your drug becomes very bad. Well, then one could theorize that if you wanted your drug to be very good, shouldn't you go to 0G, basically? And that is not something that, even though there's been, probably over $1 billion at this point, sort of spent on this type of microgravity pharmaceutical research, not a single person has ever looked at this type of like gravity sensitivity ahead of doing microgravity studies up in orbit. But it felt very sort of counterintuitive to us. So yeah, today we published this first paper where we basically showed this small molecule L-histidine had basically the sensitivity to gravity in its particle size distribution. Think of this as like when you basically crystallize this particular molecule, what size are the crystals? And we basically showed that as you increase gravity, there's variations in the size of those crystals. And so one would expect that there would also be this extrapolated variation downwards when you go down to sort of 0G. And we hope that this basically ushers in a sort of new field around basically gravity sensitivity sort of studies, both in pharmaceuticals, but probably across a wide variety of products. So you can use that to screen for, what could be some effects in microgravity.
That's incredible. By the way, you're probably inspiring a lot of scientists out there, people and researchers that just didn't think that new fields could pop up, or like there were new possibilities and dimensions to evaluate these parts of science.
And it's a very sort of fundamental, sort of effect on science in that, if you look at the 4 fundamental forces of the universe, right? It's a strong and weak nuclear force, it's electromagnetism and gravity. And in some ways, all of science is predicated on, interactions that those 4 forces have. The idea that you can actually, sort of manipulate one of those and actually remove it entirely can be a pretty radical effect across a wide set of fields. We've obviously, really focused in on pharmaceuticals, but I think over the course of sort of Varda's sort of life, I do hope that we can eventually probably not necessarily tackle ourselves. Sort of tell investors, look, we are going to be a pharma company, and then over time as we build up our platform, I'm happy to be a contract manufacturer. I don't expect in the future that we are also going to want to be a semiconductor company and a fiber optic company, et cetera. I think more likely, ideally in the success case, in 2032, when Varda's pharma factory is very large, TSMC finally realizes that they want to create a semiconductor fab up in orbit, and they come to us basically as the sort of Foxconn kind of equivalent, where we act as their sort of contract manufacturer, because we built up such a expertise in the logistics, the infrastructure of sort of running this type of industrial sort of park in orbit. But yeah, I do think there are sort of wide ranging and sort of large ramifications of the work that we do, and in some ways starting with this initial paper that we published today.
Dang, you really you took all of my questions out of what I was already gonna ask. I was gonna ask, so when are you gonna do a Varda times TSMC partnership? When are you gonna start spinning up semis? But you've already answered it. Okay, well that's
One
good.
step
You're
at a
well
time.
researched.
Gotta make our station be a multi-billion-dollar company first. That TSMC takes us seriously.
Yeah, and then you can become a trillion-dollar company, as you should.
That's the only goal in life. Gotta shift the goals, right? Yeah, billion-dollar companies aren't interesting anymore. We gotta update Aileen's unicorn term to I don't know, trinicorn or something like that.
You just mark that for your 35th birthday goal. Become a
Yeah,
trillionaire.
that'll be more of like a 40th or 45th birthday goal. Compounding takes time.
Yeah, you're right. Well, in terms of Varda, did you have any idea when you started it that you were gonna become not only a deep tech kind of master of the world, but now you're also a biotech uh expert. You're now covering like all of these different grounds of deep tech. It's space, it's bio. Given that and how constrained this category is in general, it's very cost intensive. Not many investors invest into it. You have to be very specialized. Like, what are your biggest learnings after taking the plunge and going into that?
Yeah, I can't claim that when I started Varda, I thought I was going to be, going so deep in like the, let's say, sort of pharmaceutical, industry. It was funny. I was like meeting with a sort of SVP top tier executive from a very large publicly traded biopharma company. And at one point, like in the midst of the conversation, she asked me, do you have like a chemistry background or like what's your background? I was like, no, like I'm like a computer science dropout. Like technically, like when I check the box on like what level of education, it's like high school is like technically how much I have to check. So it was sort of nice in some ways to feel like one of those moments where I was like, I'm holding my own. Like I was like reminding her of some of her like grad school chemistry concepts that she hadn't thought about in a little while to like explain to her what we were up to. And so just it's fun to see that I can kind of hold my own there. And I think if there's a sort of lesson that I've learned from it is I'd always had sort of interest in the world of sort of biotech. I remember when I was like 20, 21 years old, I dropped out of MIT, was out in San Francisco, talking to a friend that had had a decent amount of success building some biotech companies. I remember just telling him, I was like, this is a field I'm interested in. Like, how do I get going? And he was like, here's some textbooks, here's this. And it's like, you order them, you kind of read through them, but like it's just hard because like I was so good at computer science and software, et cetera. Like, why would I go do this? It's like hard to have the motivation for it. And if there's a lesson that I've learned is like when your company's life is on the line, you have way more motivation, and when you have way more motivation, you're actually going to sort of learn some real depth of these sort of concepts. And so I definitely sort of feel much more comfortable in this world now, but only because it was like, well, this is the only way to make Varda successful. So time to spend like sort of 3-4 months just nonstop immersing myself sort of in this world. And then beyond that, it's like I just have our chief scientist officer and people that I really respect. Just like anytime a new paper comes out, anything that's related to Varda, it's like walk me through it at a very sort of first principles level, and I build my way up to eventually being able to like sort of hold my own.
You started your career out as an operator. You founded a company. You worked at Teespring. And then you found yourself at Khosla Ventures, and now you're at Founders Fund. So having that operator experience and founding Varda, would you say that I feel like this is like a big debate, like in the VC world, you're getting investor experience, but there's always like, oh, you should get some operating experience. It'll like tremendously increase the quality of your deal flow, of the way you evaluate companies.
I think it has a huge effect on like my sort of investing world. My understanding of like the aerospace sector, the manufacturing sector, the biotech sector has so vastly improved over the course of the experience of Varda, and I think that really has sort of reflected in the quality of the investing that I've done over sort of the past several years, and has just made me much more comfortable in diving into sort of some of these areas. I think my ability to deal diligence things in biotech, in industrials, in robotics, in aerospace is so improved for having such, sort of close to the metal, sort of experience with this. I was talking about this actually with a, sort of friend over lunch. I think if you look at, people that land on like the top 10 of the Midas list, every year, you'll find that about a decade later, like half of that top 10, nobody thinks about it anymore. Like there are people that have just like totally sort of fallen off the face of the planet. But then you look at somebody like, sort of our, sort of CEO and, original co-founder of Founders Fund, Peter Thiel. I would argue, while, he doesn't necessarily always submit to the Midas list, I would very easily argue he's been one of the top, sort of 10 VCs in the Valley for the past several decades, combined, right? He's, probably coming up on almost, sort of 30 years, at this point of being one of the top, VCs and investors in the Valley. And, I think a part of actually what keeps him so fresh is it's probably unappreciated how regularly he still goes, sort of close to the bare metal, right? Where he actually takes a like, sort of chairman, co-founder like position, sort of in companies and gets, sort of pretty deeply involved and really understands the problem sets that they're, sort of going through in a way that I think most investors, sort of don't. And so, I do think I love our style, that we do at FF, where it's not to say we encourage incubations or anything. If anything, we like actively discourage them because, typically you should just stick to investing. But the fact that we do have a decent amount of the sort of partnership that is, very actively, close to the bare metal, I do think makes us, sort of much better investors, especially so in the fields that our companies operate in.
Are you saying like that has like maybe 10x or maybe move the mark a little bit further on what you thought you would achieve as an investor or what you thought like quality investments would look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think objectively, if you look at, again, I use the Midas list as, the marker because it is, sort of the best, sort of, ranking that we have on performance. And it's not just like run by Forbes, right? It's run by a highly qualified and competent, LP that happens to, sort of publish it in conjunction, sort of with Forbes. But it's not like journalists are doing this ranking. It's like, financially sophisticated, sort of insiders. And if you look at, sort of top 100 on the Midas list, for VCs that started their career sort of pre-2012 called versus post-2012, pre-2012, there was definitely a large number of investors that were pure sort of financial analysts, earlier in their career. Bill Gurley is an example, Mary Meeker, Michael Moritz, from the sort of journalism, sort of world. Tons of investors that you can point to that very much so did not have this operational background. As you start to look at, sort of as it becomes 2012 and onwards when people start their venture career, it becomes much, much heavier in that sort of top stratus of, best venture investors. A much higher percentage of them end up having significant, sort of operating experience. And so I think in some ways, we can argue about the philosophy of this, but in some ways, Darwinistically, the Midas list is somewhat proving that, it appears to be quite necessary if you want to be in the upper stratus of investors to have some level of serious, sort of operating experience. On a very personal level, yeah, I did find it to be both valuable before even becoming an investor, having that experience, and that in the early days of Khosla Ventures, I felt like I just had a level of moral authority with advising and even reaching out to founders that people that sort of jump straight into investing didn't have. And then now, especially so in the sort of post Varda world, there are just so many investments and things that I can point to where I either wouldn't have gotten into the deal, I wouldn't have been able to diligence it, it wouldn't have kind of crossed my desk, sort of if not for it. I find that my sort of quality of investing is significantly sort of improved post Varda, despite the fact that in some ways I'm obviously spending much less time on it, because of because of the sort of time constraints that Varda provides me. And so yeah, I do tend to tell people, I'm not sure, obviously, maybe you'll be a sort of counterpoint here, but I mostly tell people, the idea of going straight from college into venture, I don't think is necessarily, sort of the best idea. I think it's one where maybe you should do it for a couple of years, but then maybe go join a super promising portfolio company, then come back to it. It's a career that, is measured, its success is measured over the course of sort of decades. And so make sure to think in the order of decades. And that may mean at certain points of it, not necessarily, being a full-time investor.
You went from Khosla to Founders Fund.
Yep.
And Founders Fund is recognized as being very like focused on investing in self-reliant founders, people that might not need your help. What are the biggest differences between the two firms that you worked at, given those are your experiences? And what do you think is beneficial with that?
Yeah, I think in the grand scheme of like, let's say the bell curve of types of cultures and firms and investing styles in Silicon Valley, KV and FF are like, about as close in some ways as it gets. they're both relatively small investment teams. They both have sort of prolific founder CEOs that sometimes are vilified in the media. They both like to invest in true technical moonshots, right? Founders Fund being the largest sort of investor in SpaceX, Khosla Ventures being the largest investor in Rocket Lab, and then in some ways more recently, the only equity owner in OpenAI other than Microsoft. And so, clearly both firms that are very successful, sort of backing true technical moonshots. After that, there tend to be sort of, I would say, a lot of differences. I think sort of one of those obvious ones is just like the way that the firms structure their time. Coastal Ventures is known for their call it 4 to 6 to 8 hour long sort of Monday partner meetings where the entire team gets together. Partner presentations are done where companies get invited in to present to the entire team, and that's where a lot of the investment decision making effectively happens, is on that Monday sort of meeting. Founders Fund is like sort of in some ways truly the opposite, completely sort of unstructured in terms of sort of time and decision making. In that we don't proactively get together sort of once a week. Everything sort of bubbles up sort of from within. One of my former colleagues quips or ways that he would describe it is Founders Fund sometimes feels like the blockchain of VCs, where it's sort of fully decentralized, and then sort of use technology as a way to form a sort of internal consensus. I think they both have their sort of pros and cons. At Coastal Ventures, I do think one of the sort of maybe one last difference that I'll articulate is I think sometimes you can also tell a firm's culture by like what is the first question that they ask when considering an investment. At KV, generally the first question was what is the technological differentiation that this company has, versus at Founders Fund, typically the very first question we ask is sort of why are we going to appreciate this company and others won't, right? And it's sort of filtering for let's say technical moat and barrier in the KV side of things versus let's say level of contrarian on the FF side of things. I think they both come with sort of pros and sort of cons. I think KV is a really great place to sort of learn venture, in that you just get so much sort of exposure to the team because of those 8 hour long partner meetings. There's very rigorous discussions, a memo writing culture. Usually like they're inundated with information in a way that really allows you to learn via osmosis. On the flip side, I find Founders Fund a really great place to, if you already kind of know what you want to do and have your sort of strategy laid out, it's a great place to execute with very minimal friction, given that it is sort of so decentralized. And so I think sort of both should come with pros and cons. In some ways, I'm very happy the way my sort of career has been structured to date, where it's like I felt like I got to really go learn a lot of how to practice venture at KV, and then was given the opportunity to practice it the exact way that I wanted, basically at FF.
You moved from San Francisco to go to this beautiful island-like resort world of Miami. What have you learned from getting out of that bubble to coming to Miami? Obviously, you're a huge advocate, and you've also built a company in Los Angeles, another beautiful place that I love. But what was your biggest learning, getting that reflection, getting out of the bubble and into a broad new world?
Yeah, I think I can talk about like why I advocate so much for Miami, and why I feel like I'm far more productive here than any other city in the United States, and feel like it's a model city of the future more so than anywhere else. But when I think about sort of what did I learn from sort of leaving, I think it's that independent thinking is extremely difficult to accomplish, and you kind of need to take sort of every possible advantage that you can get in order to even have a chance to have a sort of unique thought. And I think I probably underappreciated how much even just being sort of physically near the sort of intellectual bubble of San Francisco led me to succumbing sort of to it. Like I when I lived there, thought of myself as a very independent thinker, versus the types of ideas that I'm much more willing to play around with in Miami are far more sort of radical. And I think a part of it comes from this like very innate I was sort of recently chatting with a professional colleague, not an FF colleague, but somebody that we have some professional overlap with that lives in San Francisco, and they were sort of claiming to be a true sort of advocate of free speech, and it was so clear that the bar for what they considered acceptable versus unacceptable speech was very different than what is the average bar in Miami. And so they believed to be themselves very genuinely an advocate for free speech. And yet, if they were somebody that was in Miami and having a sort of casual sort of dinner conversation, they would be considered quite censorious. And so I think when you're embedded in that culture, it can be very easy to succumb to that just, sort of morally corrupt, censorious, hypocritical culture, right? My somewhat, sort of quippy one-liner that I, will sometimes use about San Francisco that I think reflects, both the values there, but then also, how it affects you intellectually is that, like, sort of progressive SF liberals are actually some of the most racist people that I've ever met, on the planet. They claim to be very open to new ideas. They claim to be very open to sort of new cultures. But ultimately, if you look at it, it is an extremely, sort of homogenous and mono, sort of culture that is, extremely intolerant of any, sort of radical, ideas. And so, they claim to have, diversity, yet they lack even the basics of diversity of skin color and diversity of thought. Walk around, sort of Chestnut Street in San Francisco, and it is going to be like 99% white people. Walk outside of, sort of my office here, you're basically going to see, sort of every color on the rainbow, but nobody's going to even be shouting it from the rooftops because in San Francisco, it's proclaimed to have diversity versus Miami just has it. And so there's no need to proclaim it.
To shift back to LA, so we alluded to this a little bit in the beginning, but El Segundo. Some call it Gundo, some call it Gundo, I don't know. But they have kind of taken up a storm on Twitter in the last couple of months. I'm curious, from your perspective, is this a net positive? Is this good for the ecosystem? Some of it might not be the most tasteful kind of representations of building companies, but what is your perspective, having built a company in El Segundo, funded companies in the area, have been a deeper part of the DeepTech aerospace industry? What do you think of all this that's going on?
A couple different, angles that one could take here. I think, first on like the, sort of positive spin of it, I do think that we would hope to have a, sort of society that inspires people to, sort of be working in, sort of deeply technical fields and really pushing the field of engineering forward more so than having people, grow up wanting to be like YouTubers or TikTokers, right? And so, any type of marketing that influences that, I see to be, sort of highly positive. I think some of my, let's say, underlying, let's say, critiques of some of the sort of current movement are sort of twofold. The first is I do think you have to be sort of cautious about how one brands oneself, and in particular, I find some of the like sort of Gundo bros or Gundo boys culture a bit off-putting to people that are not of the male gender, and it's something that I've heard validated sort of across the board. And I think that is an okay thing to do on the weekends with your boys in a like personal setting, and like lift your weights, drink your protein shakes, smoke your cigarettes, etc. But I think in a professional setting, you are just actually like sort of limiting your talent pool quite significantly. And so I'm not sure it's like appropriate in a sort of professional world. As somebody who, by the way, I very much try to push the boundaries on what's acceptable in the professional world, right? So it's like if it's triggering even my instincts, I think that is always something to sort of reflect upon. So that's probably sort of the first critique. The second critique is I do think that there are moments in time where there are real opportunities around certain fields, and moments in time there aren't. Let's take sort of aerospace as a particular example, and maybe Founders Fund's pattern of investing in aerospace over the past 25 years. In the 07 through, or let's say when Founders Fund first started, from 04 to 07, we didn't know aerospace investing. From 07 through 2011, we did a decent amount, investing in a lot into SpaceX, a very small amount into Planet Labs, and ultimately didn't really invest then for about a decade sort of straight, partially because you really needed to see that first generation of company sort of succeed before there really was an opportunity for other models beyond just launch and Earth observation and satellite internet to really make sense. And in some ways, we really picked up investing in 2020 through 2023. And I think it was a really opportune sort of window to be starting an aerospace company, because there was now a second generation of business models that were sort of viable. Companies like Hadrian, like Senra, like Varda, like Impulse Space, things that we really sort of believed in. But there's a world now where we don't necessarily invest in aerospace for another, sort of 10 years. And so, sometimes, some of these movements, I think, can sometimes be a bit mistimed, where, I think the, sort of, window of opportunity may have, somewhat closed for the next, 5, 6, 7 years, while you wait for the second generation of companies to, really succeed. And then there will be, I'm not saying that the window is permanently closed. I'm just saying that there are just certain times in industries. And so I sometimes find some of this marketing to be a bit, sort of mistimed, where, you're sort of, coming into this field when it's already sort of past its zenith. And if anything, we should be focusing on other aspects of, rare earth, minerals production, industrial automation, robotics, much more so than I would say actually aerospace defense. There's probably not that many more interesting companies to be built, in today's, sort of time. But there very well maybe another, sort of window of opportunity in 4 or 7, sort of 10 years. And so I think that's where, sort of, my, quip that originally started off as a sort of internal, sort of Slack at FF and obviously turned into a tweet was, sort of a, sort of El Segundo bull, Gundo bear, where, it's companies like, Hadrian, Senra, Varda, et cetera, that have been in El Segundo now for many years on end. And, this type of marketing is not necessarily something that I would, want, my office culture to be particularly, affiliated with, right? I think, there are some very important leaders at, Varda that probably are not that interested in the, sort of Gundo bro culture. And I say this as somebody that was like in a fraternity and has been accused of being sometimes too broy, myself many a time. And I'd be proud to be a bro. I like my deadlifting. I like my squatting. I like my sort of benching. I'm not sure that that's something that I'd be doing inside of an office environment though, given that that's not necessarily a culture that everybody feels comfortable with.
Well, I definitely agree with that being of the opposite gender. It's not very fun to see more of like not the most positive narratives being circulated, but then you also think from a responsible standpoint, how is this going to attract more talent if you're setting yourself up in this view? And it's like curious and it's interesting the difference between online personalities and actual professional personalities. I'm sure you've experienced this, right? Like being active on Twitter and having all this stuff. Like, no, like at the end of the day, you're still a professional investor. You work for one of the top tier funds. Like you still have to come to the table prepared and I think that's just a learning curve that might progress. But let's hope that this professionalizes maybe and becomes a little bit more buttoned up. But it's certainly been a movement, and
it already exists though. It's the El Segundo movement. You know what I mean? Like there is this sort of professional, equivalent. Like, I think myself and Chris Powers and Jordan Black, et cetera, have done a pretty great job of marketing over the past sort of couple of years. And so, it's funny. There's somebody that sort of tweeted and replied to my thing, being like, Don's jealous because he's been in El Segundo for a while, but like the Gundo Bros are getting the main stage. And my reply to that was like, what size of stage are we talking about here? Like, are we talking about like Twitter followings? Because those don't compare. Are we talking about like who is accomplishing sort of real hardware? We have like a reactor capsule video that got whatever 1.4 million views. It's like that is definitely not the reason why I'm critiquing for this movement. It's that I think we want to make sure that we make this particular city acceptable to a wide set of talent.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting one. But to close out, okay, so maybe we get a little bit more personal here. You've been very vocal about being a new father on Twitter. It seems you might have even gotten wiser. So what has been
is that even possible? I'm so wise already.
I mean, after seeing your birthday tweet with all the wisdom, I was like, oh my gosh, I really didn't know that Dalai was this like introspective.
How dare you, Molly?
Sorry.
Are you trying to say that I come off as shallow?
Okay, you're a very wise person. You've been wise the entire time.
There we go. That's what I like to hear.
This has not changed at all.
There we go. Stroke the ego.
You might even be a genius.
Thank you. There we go. That's the framing that I like to hear.
Anyways, getting back to but with your newborn, right? Like you probably have an entirely new perspective on the world. I would love to learn, like, how has that changed your outlook on life and building and creating an ambitious future? Having a child.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like sort of Eastern European Slavic culture is, sort of very, sort of pro-family, pro-children, sort of pro-future, pro-building. Part of why I actually think like, sort of Western Europe is, headed into probably a multi-decade decline and it's going to regulate itself to death, while Eastern Europe probably, steadily starts to, sort of exit from the EU and is, sort of pro-mathematics and pro-building. And so I go to like, sort of the capital of, Bulgaria, Sofia, and I feel like I just see like way more interesting startups than I do in like London at this point. And so, because you start to extrapolate that out, you can just see it in like, GDP growth in London has effectively been flat now for almost like 15 years. Whereas like in Bulgaria, the last 15 years has been like, a 10 or, and again, they're starting off in different bases, but still you continue to extrapolate that trend for another 10 years. And like Western Europe's going to look like a second world country while Eastern Europe actually, sort of rises to the top. So, I think, having a kid, is something that I felt like I was, sort of always, very excited to, experience, and something that I've thought about a lot even before having him. So in some ways, it didn't feel like, sort of that massive a shift, but it has been a, sort of real reminder of just, I really do think your sort of, duty in life and purpose of life is to ultimately, expand life and extend it. And, to date, the only way to really, sort of do that is to have children, given that it's the only way to extend life beyond your death. And, I just, love the experience of being a father, sort of philosophically at a very, sort of, cerebral, sort of level in terms of, I feel like I can see how, my son is hopefully going to be wealthier, wiser, and live longer than I am and get to experience a, sort of more bright future. And so I love it on a cerebral level, but I also love it on a like very practical level of just like, every day I get to like, pick up, my son and smile at him and like feed him in the morning and hang out with him. And it's just like by far, the most fulfilling and, phenomenal way to start off every single day. And so, I hope that, being vocal about fatherhood encourages many other men that, maybe are feeling on the fence or unsure whether to commit or unsure whether or not they're ready for kids, to hopefully realize that this is like really just the most fulfilling experience one can have in, sort of life. And I feel very fortunate and glad and happy that we both had a very, sort of so far, knock on wood and everything, very healthy first kid, but also that I've gotten to have it, I think relatively, not as early as, typical in Eastern European thought culture where most people are having their kids 21 to 25 years old. But I still feel very happy that I was able to have my kid, basically at 30 years old and get to experience so many more years of my, sort of life with him relative to having him, if I was, 50 or 60, where just by default, obviously less of your, years that you're alive, you get to have, sort of with your kids. And in some ways with your grandkids, and hopefully obviously knock on wood with ultimately my great grandkids. I feel also very lucky that my son today currently has a great grandmother that is still alive. She's 94 years old, and I hope that they sort of get to meet this summer in Bulgaria. I think that'll be a really special moment to see all, what is it, 5 generations, son, father, grandpa, great grandma, great grandma, all 5 generations sitting side by side.
Wow, that's beautiful. And I think that does set a really good example for others out there that might be on the fence or might be stuck in the dating apps and don't know how to pick up a phone and call someone. But between, all of the congratulations to you, you've like really accomplished a lot so far in your career. It's amazing. I remember meeting you, like you were one of the first people I met in Venture. I called my friend. I was like, hey, I'm coming to SF. Is there anybody I should meet? And she was like, oh, you got to meet my friend Owen. And then Owen was like, oh, you got to meet my friend Delian. He's like, you have to like compliment him on his Twitter, but you should meet him. And I was like, okay, yeah, sure. So I met you, and it's been awesome to kind of like even see that journey like early in my career and see your progression. So thank you for taking the time on the call, and congratulations again on promotion to partner, Varda's landing, and your newborn Beat.
Thanks, Molly. I appreciate you having me on, and see you soon.
All right, see ya.